So today I want you to all hear a podcast on the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War is a major conflict for world history, and the end of the war, the Peace of Westphalia, really marks the end of Period 1, what we've been dwelling in from 1450 to 1648, which we talked about on the very first day of school, if you remember how conflicts really mark these different divisions for the European history curriculum. So the 30 Years' War really can be viewed as a major watershed in European history. And I am not going to be the one speaking today for this podcast, so you have good fortune to not hear me go on and on. Instead, we're going to have Mrs. Thompson be our guest speaker for the day, if you will. And she's going to be speaking on the 30 Years' War. It's a complex war, has many different venues, and she has graciously provided some notes for you, which I will be passing out in class. And this is some images from the podcast, as well as so you'll be hearing her voice for the remainder of the podcast. So once again, welcome, and sit tight, relax, and enjoy the 30 Years' War.
Okay, so let's start with just some background on the 30 Years' War, and I'm going to be working off of those typed notes, so you're going to be adding some notes on the side. The 30 Years' War was most certainly a complex war. It was a civil war, and it was fought over religious issues, Catholic versus Protestant, but it was also fought over constitutional issues. So you have princes of the states vying for power against the Holy Roman Emperor. And finally, it was an international war. It was a war which really culminated the tension between the Habsburgs and the French. You see the Dutch fighting the Spanish in this war. You also see Denmark fighting the Swedes, and involvement of individual states of the Holy Roman Empire. It was also a war where you see military revolution occurring. You have what are called soldiers of fortune fighting in this war. These are military leaders that are really fighting for their own personal benefit. We're going to talk about one by the name of Wallenstein. You see the size of armies increasing significantly during this war. The French army was about 125,000. Originally grew to about 250,000. The Swedish army had about 150,000. So army sizes increased significantly. You also see this war as a military revolution because you see new organized armies and you see new formations, particularly coming out of the Swedish army, which during this war was led by Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. You have much more flexible formations. You have the use of pikemen and muskets. You have more mobile artillery. You have improved military training of these professional fighting forces. You, as I said, you see in this war warfare as really a form of business, or fighting in a war as a way of making money, which Machiavelli warned you against, but certainly says something about the type of men fighting and the violence that occurred during this war. This war also was incredibly damaging to the Holy Roman Empire and the states of Germany, or the German states. Approximately 1/3 of the population of the Holy Roman Empire died in the 30 Years' War, which I'll refer to again. You had staggering losses. About 15 to 20% of those who died in the conflict, but you also had death as a result of outbreaks of disease as well as outbreaks of famine. And you see new laws of war being created because of this, which we'll talk about later on. One really, I think, vivid example of how destructive this war was, and this is actually not in your notes, during the third phase of the war, which was the Swedish phase in the 1630s, the city of Magdeburg was taken by the Swedes. It was sacked, it was totally burned, and thousands of civilians were killed within that city. So this war, you see actually fighting occurring within towns and cities. It was a war that destroyed the German states well beyond the military. Okay, let's go to some background issues. The Holy Roman Empire, as it says in the notes, was economically and culturally backwards. You had over 1,000 autonomous states, and this is what we refer to as German particularism. Basically, these states wanted to have sovereignty. You also have problems of secession. You have wars breaking out. There was a war over the region of Cologne, which is east of Aachen. Aachen was in the Holy Roman State of Luxembourg. There was a war there over who was going to control that area. You also see Calvinists fighting for control. Now, if you remember, the Peace of Augsburg did not address Calvinists. So let me just review for a minute what exactly the Peace of Augsburg said in 1555. According to the Peace of Augsburg, German princes could choose either to be Lutheran or Catholic, and whatever they chose, their realm became the same. If Lutherans lived in ecclesiastical states, which were states controlled by Catholic bishops, those Lutherans could remain Lutheran, and so eventually those bishops went into exile and the territory was taken over. So Lutherans were able to keep any territory that they captured from the Catholic Church. And if ecclesiastical leaders, if bishops of the Catholic Church converted to Lutheranism, they had to give up the Catholic territory. This principle is called ecclesiastical reservation. So in the Peace of Augsburg, we do not see any reference to Calvinists. There were, however, Calvinists in the German states, and these Calvinists, as I said, had absolutely no rights within the German states. And because of that, they began to actually fight for rights, and we see examples of that, especially in regions such as the Palatinate. The Palatinate, as it says in your notes, made up or held one seat on the group that voted on who was going to be the Holy Roman Emperor. The Palatinate is right above the region of Bavaria. It was a very influential region. The elector of the Palatinate was Frederick IV, who began what was known as the Protestant Union. And Frederick IV had the support, as it has in your notes, of the Dutch, the English, so all the other Protestant influences. And if you take a look there, as well as Henry IV of France, which shows you that religion really didn't matter much from the beginning of this war. The Protestant Union was countered by the Catholic League, and the Catholic League was influenced primarily by the Catholic states in the Holy Roman Empire, in particular Bavaria, and Maximilian, who's the Duke of Bavaria, led it. Ferdinand II, who was Holy Roman Emperor from 1619 to 1637, one of his goals was to Catholicize, to get rid of Lutherans and Calvinists within the empire. Now, before Ferdinand II, you had Emperor Matthias. Emperor Matthias was Holy Roman Emperor from 1612 to 1619. And before Matthias, you had Ferdinand I, who was Holy Roman Emperor from 1556 to 1612. Ferdinand I took over after Charles V split the empire between his brother Ferdinand I and his sons Philip II. So the Spanish Habsburgs, like Philip II, were affected by the situation in the German states. And they were affected not just because their relatives were affected, the Austrian Habsburgs, but they were also affected because they needed to trade through that region. In order to get from Spain to Flanders, which was part of the Spanish Netherlands, they had to go through German territory. So if the territory was Lutheran, they were not allowed through. So they needed to create what's called a Spanish road to Flanders, and that's why they supported the war against the Lutherans. There are 4 phases of the 30 Years' War. The first phase is what we call the Bohemian phase, and that phase was from 1618 to 1625. Then you have what's known as the Danish phase, which is 1625 to 1629. After the Danish phase, you have what's known as the Swedish phase, which was from 1629 or 1630, really, to 1635. And then the last phase of the 30 Years' War is the Franco-Swedish phase, or the Swedish-French War, which was from 1635 to 1648. So we're going to start with the Bohemian phase, which is the first phase. So you want to go to slide 31 and 32. Okay, let's start with Bohemia. The initial cause of this phase was because of the interests of the Calvinist people within the region of Bohemia. And Ferdinand II, when he became emperor in 1619, started to shut down Protestant churches in the region, and that really sparked this war. It began before 1619, but that really brought it to a head. Bohemians within this territory were led by a man named Count Matthias. Count Matthias was very much against the influence of the Holy Roman Empire, was very much against Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, who was Ferdinand II's cousin. And just as a side note, Ferdinand II, before he became Holy Roman Emperor, after Matthias dies in 1619, Ferdinand II was elected the King of Bohemia. He was given control over Bohemia and the Diet there, just so you know where he is before 1619. Emperor Matthias sent some delegates to Bohemia to negotiate with the Calvinists there, and the Calvinists there had no rights at all, but he sent delegates there to negotiate, and those delegates were they were put on this fake mock trial and thrown out of a window, and this is slide 31, and that's known as the defenestration of Prague. Now, according to the Protestant story, they fell 70 feet and they were saved by landing in a pile of manure, and they only suffered minor injuries. The Catholic story is that they were saved by angels. Anyway, they were thrown out of the royal palace in Prague in 1618, and Emperor Matthias responds by sending the troops there. The Bohemian Diet, in response, overthrows King Ferdinand and objects to Emperor Matthias's troops, elects their own king, and their own king is slide 32, and that king is Frederick V. Frederick V becomes the King of Bohemia, and Frederick V is nicknamed the Winter King. He is married to the daughter of James I, and he is supported by the French. Matthias dies in 1619, and his successor, as I said, is his cousin, Ferdinand II, who had served as the King of Bohemia before Frederick V. And as you know, he's a Catholic Habsburg. And he's getting a lot of support and money from the Pope. He's also getting support and money from the Spanish Habsburgs. Finally, he's getting a tremendous amount of support from the Bavarians, the Catholic League, and Maximilian of Bavaria is supporting him. Protestant troops attacked the Austrian city of Vienna, and even though they attacked Vienna, they were overwhelmed by the Catholic troops who responded, and those Catholic troops supporting the Holy Roman Emperor were led by Count von Tilly. And the famous battle of the first phase of the war is the Battle of White Mountain, which is near Prague, and this was in 1620, and at the Battle of White Mountain, the nobility, the Protestant nobility who fought there, were crushed. At that point, Frederick V of Bohemia flees Bohemia for his life, and that's why he's called the Winter King, because he was only elected king over the winter months. He had a very short tenure, and all of the territory of Bohemia is taken over by Ferdinand II and the Spanish Habsburgs. So once Ferdinand II of the Habsburgs is elected emperor, he confiscates all of the rebel land, and he redistributes that land to those who supported them. And he begins really a counter-reformation in Bohemia, or the mission of ridding Bohemia of Calvinist influence. And this phase shows that the Spanish Habsburgs are going to be very involved with what goes on along that Spanish road to Flanders that I spoke about. In 1629, they passed the Treaty of Lubeck, which is in your notes, and this is under results. And in the Treaty of Lubeck, actually I'm not sure if that's in your notes, I'm looking, yes it is. The Treaty of Lubeck, 1629, okay, so by the end of phase one, the Protestant mission against the Catholic Habsburgs had failed. And you start to see a shift then in control over the Protestant mission. The Lutheran king of Denmark at the time is Christian IV, and you can see a picture of Christian IV on slide 35 in the PowerPoint. If you go back to slide 33, you'll see Ferdinand II with his great mustache, and then you'll see Count von Tilly on slide 34. Slide 35 is Christian IV, who was the king of Denmark from 1588 to 1648, and he was actually more important than just being the king of Denmark at the time. He also controlled the region of Holstein, and Holstein is within the border of the Holy Roman Empire, so you want to write this down. So he is the Duke of Holstein. Therefore, he is also a prince within the Holy Roman Empire. So not only was he a Lutheran and supporter of the Protestant Union, officially he became the leader of the Protestant Union as of 1621, he also was a prince within the empire who wanted to suppress Ferdinand II. So he takes over the Protestant Union, and he has an alliance with the French and the Dutch. In 1623, all the territory that was Protestant, was fighting on behalf of Bohemia, is transferred over to the leader of Bavaria, Maximilian. So the Palatinate turns hands. And Richelieu and Louis XIII of France are beginning to work much more obviously now with the Protestant alliance against the Habsburgs. So you start to see raison d'etat from Richelieu, or what is in the best interest of the French state. You also have another famous battle of Phase 1, and that is the battle. You can see it, the spelling of it on slide 34, the victory at Statlan. The Battle of Statlan was in 1623, and this was another battle where the Catholics came out on top. So the Bohemian phase ends with Catholic Habsburg Ferdinand II's victory and a shift over the Protestant League. So the Protestant League is under the control, now I'm going on to the second phase, Phase 2, is under the control of Christian IV, Duke of Holstein. And Protestants everywhere are becoming very fearful of Ferdinand II's influence even outside of the Holy Roman Empire. And the Protestants are getting direct support from the Protestant Dutch, from the English, as well as I said, Richelieu and the French. In 1625, the Dutch, the English, and the French, supporting the Protestants, attacked the northern German states. And Ferdinand II raises an army to counteract them. And that army was under the leadership of Albert Wallenstein, who was obviously working with Count von Tilly. And he had a private army, Wallenstein. You can see a picture of Wallenstein, I believe. Let me see where he is. So he's at slide 38, excuse me. On slide 38, you'll see a picture of Catholic General Albert Wallenstein. He had about 50,000 soldiers working with him to fight Christian IV. Wallenstein was a Bohemian noble, and he actually was an opportunistic Protestant. He's fighting for the Catholics to make money. They defeated the King of Denmark, and this was at the famous Battle of Lutter, L-U-T-T-R. At the Battle of Lutter, Denmark declared defeat. They also had declared bankruptcy at the same time. And what results from the end of the second phase, which is the Danish phase, was that Ferdinand issues in 1629 what's known as the Edict of Restitution. The Edict of Restitution returns all confiscated church land, so all land that was given over to the Lutherans, back to the Catholic Church. It confiscates the church land from the Lutherans. It gives it back to the Catholics. And this angers Protestants everywhere. It also angers Wallenstein because he expected that he was going to get some of this land. He did not get some of the land. You're talking about 16 bishoprics and 28 cities were given back to Catholics. By 1630, Wallenstein is fired. And this shift in the land was not only because of the Edict of Restitution in 1629. You also should note another treaty that was part of the second phase, and that was also in 1629, and that was the Treaty of Lubeck, which is under C3 in the notes. The Treaty of Lubeck said that Denmark can get back Danish lands, but has to make a promise not to intervene in affairs of the empire ever again. So Christian IV really does take then a back seat in terms of the Protestant mission. Ferdinand II starts his counter-reformation, and continues it, I should say, and Spanish Habsburg troops are moving throughout the Palatinate and getting ready to attack Holland, because remember that peace between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Dutch Netherlands was not officially made until 1648, so they're still fighting. This brings us to the third phase of the 30 Years' War, and that phase is known as the Swedish phase. If you take a look at your PowerPoint, you can see the Swedish general, or I should say the Swedish king at the time, Gustavus Adolphus. He is on slide 36. You can see him again on slide 37. Let's talk a little bit about reaction to the Edict of Restitution. The Edict of Restitution really did cause an outcry amongst Protestants throughout Europe. They felt that Ferdinand was going to attack Protestants outside of the empire. They were already fearful of that 15 years earlier. Now they were in a panic, and Richelieu of France becomes directly involved then to help the Protestant Union. The King of Sweden at the time was Gustavus Adolphus. His nickname is the Lion of the North. He ruled Sweden from 1611 to 1632. He's credited for creating the first modern army, and that is because he made service to the military mandatory for all peasants in Sweden. So he had a tremendous military force, as I said in the beginning of the broadcast, and he also redesigned the way they were trained. He was originally fighting against Catholic Poland, and then he got involved in the war against the German states. He had support from the Dutch, he had support from Saxony, which is interesting, and Brandenburg. Saxony, a Protestant region, as you know from the very beginning, and Brandenburg at first did not support him. But then they became extremely afraid of Ferdinand, so they threw their support behind the Swedes. Adolphus was only 17 years old when he began fighting in these major wars against Russia and Poland. And the reason why he got involved in these wars was because he was trying to create what's known as a Swedish lake. That Swedish lake was going to be the Baltic. He wanted to surround the Baltic by Swedish territory. And in order to do that, he had to get land from Poland, from Russia, and from the German states. Adolphus landed in Germany in 1630, and he had financial and military support of the French. Okay, let's go to the events of the war. Wallenstein, who we talked about earlier, had been fired. He also then was assassinated by an Irish mercenary. So the Holy Roman Emperor's troops were led again by Count von Tilly as well as Maximilian of Bavaria. Count von Tilly fell in battle during the third phase, the Swedish phase, in 1632. The Swedes initially were successful in fighting the Holy Roman Empire. The Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Gustavus Adolphus is killed, but the Swedes won that battle. The Swedes actually advanced all the way to Bohemia, and then a peace treaty was signed. Saxony and some other German states actually abandoned the Swedes and made individual peace treaties with the Holy Roman Empire. This was called the Peace of Prague in 1635. This was a total, basically, backstabbing on the part of some of these Protestant states who had supported the Protestant Union. The reason why they withdrew their support from the Swedes is because they started to grow fearful of the Swedish government, that Sweden was going to try to take over their territories. So they basically went with the group that they thought was the least threat, and that would be the Habsburgs. So this actually supported the Habsburg mission, the Peace of Prague. In response to this peace treaty, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II agreed that he would annul the Edict of Restitution, or basically delay it, for 40 years. And so therefore they didn't have to give the land back right away to the Catholic Church. That was a compromise that they made. The results of the Peace of Prague was that the Swedes were left completely isolated, and Spanish Habsburg troops were able to then finally conquer the Swedish troops and German Protestant troops that remained allied with them by the end of 1635. And that brings us to the last phase of the 30 Years' War, which is known as the Swedish-French War, or the Franco-Swedish phase. This is definitely the most violent phase of the war. Germany, or the German states, really became the battleground within towns and cities, and it was the battleground for multiple European nations. So you have multiple nations involved, and you have them all fighting within the German states for the most part, so an incredible amount of destruction. So the remainder of the 30 Years' War was really an international war. It was a Habsburg-Bourbon conflict, and the sides, which I put in your notes, were Spain, Austrian Habsburgs, plus other Catholic German states, versus the French, the Dutch, and the Swedes. The Swedish chancellor at this time was Oxenstierna, Oxenstierna, whose name you really don't need to know, but I just wanted you to know who was leading Sweden at this point. Okay, so this was an international phase. So Emperor Ferdinand II annuls the Edict of Restitution with the Peace of Prague. He says that he's going to delay it for 40 years. But in 1635, the French renewed their support for the Protestant mission, And they did this because they feared that the Habsburgs were going to attack France because of earlier support. So Richelieu in 1635 sends renewed assistance to the Swedes, sends actually one of their military generals, who was a German-born man, Bernard de Saxe-Weimar, and they openly declare war on the Spanish Habsburgs. In response, the Spanish Habsburgs move their troops into French territory, and they actually take over the city of Paris for a period of time. The Spanish Habsburgs, however, are dealing with their own issues. There was a rebellion within Portugal, and Philip IV of Spain was having to deal with that, plus having to deal with the war against the French. The French recognized the independence of Portugal, and the French actually sent troops to support the Portuguese against the Spanish Habsburgs. In 1637, Ferdinand II dies. So from 1637 to 1657, Ferdinand III is the new Holy Roman Emperor. The Dutch, meanwhile, are fighting. The Spanish Habsburgs alongside the French, and there was a famous naval battle between the Dutch and the Spanish Habsburgs, and that was the Battle of Downs in 1639. You also had a very famous battle known as the Battle of Rocroi, R-O-C-R-O-I, which was in 1643. Before that battle, in 1642, Cardinal Richelieu dies, and in 1643, Louis XIII dies, and he's followed, as you know, by Louis XIV. So the French are able to defeat the Spanish Habsburgs at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643. But by the time they defeat the Spanish Habsburgs, you start to see that both sides, for the most part, are exhausted. And you would have expected that there would have been a very quick end to this war once the French beat the Spanish Habsburgs and once the Austrian Habsburgs were losing on the Eastern Front. But, you know, and also another issue is that very few of the German states really wanted the French support for the Protestant mission because they were worried about French influence within their territory. So Ferdinand III offered amnesty, not Ferdinand II. I believe in your notes it might say Ferdinand II. You want to make sure that you realize it's Ferdinand III. Offered amnesty to opposing German states, and it takes years for a peace treaty to be established. But eventually, the peace treaty, the end of the 30 Years' War, and if you take a look at the map, which is slide 40, you'll see the result of the 30 Years' War, is the Peace of Westphalia. As I have stated earlier, the 30 Years' War was a devastating war for the German states. 1/3 of the German population was killed. You also see some new rules of warfare being established as a result of the 30 Years' War. Hugo Grotius, a Dutch author, wrote on laws of war and peace, in which he outlines basically rules of conduct during wartime. In 1644, the leaders met in the city of in the region of Westphalia, and they established two treaties: the Treaty of Munster and the Treaty of Osnabrück, Osnabruck. And these two treaties made up the Treaty of Westphalia. What's interesting is the Pope never signed the Treaty of Westphalia. Another problem with the Treaty of Westphalia was that the French, who was being dominated by Mazarin under Louis XIV, and the Spanish under Philip IV, refused to sign a peace treaty with each other and were at war until 1559. In 1559, they signed the Peace of the Pyrenees. The reason why they finally came to peace was because Louis XIV married the daughter of Spanish Philip IV, Maria Theresa. So that was really a diplomatic marriage that eventually led to peace. Okay, so the Peace of Westphalia. Two treaties originally create the Peace of Westphalia. And what did the Peace of Westphalia say? And this is very important, the provisions of Westphalia. First off, it renewed the Peace of Augsburg, but it allowed Calvinism as part of the mix. So you could be either Catholic, Calvinist, or Lutheran within the Holy Roman Empire. It took all secularized church territories after 1552, and it distributed them again to the people of the state. So it revoked completely the Edict of Restitution. The Holy Roman Empire did not cease to exist as a result of the Peace of Westphalia, but the Holy Roman Empire certainly declined in influence. A common mistake is that students write that the Holy Roman Empire completely dissolved or completely ceased to exist. The power of the Holy Roman Empire dissolved. The end of the Holy Roman Empire as an effective political entity is really seen in the Peace of Westphalia. So the Austrian Habsburgs are no longer really in control of Central and Eastern Europe. The Dutch and the Swiss break away, and if you look at that map, you can see an independent. Okay, so you have an independent United Provinces of the Netherlands or Dutch Republic formed in 1648. You have an independent Swiss cantons or Helvetic state formed as well. The French gained territory in the Peace of Westphalia. They took some of the Lorraine territory from the Holy Roman Empire, including Alsace, Metz, Toul, and Verdun, and they emerged as the strongest state in Europe. The King of Sweden was able to maintain some territory. They got 3 votes in the major Diet of the German states. They got the region of Bremen within the Holy Roman Empire and the region of West Pomerania within the Holy Roman Empire. Brandenburg got territory. They got East Pomerania, Magdeburg, which had been burned down, and 3 other territories. Bavaria gained control over the Palatinate and had 8 votes on the Central Diet, so it was very influential. And a new constitution was formed within the German states. You have what's called virtual sovereignty, or what can be referred to as virtual sovereignty for the German states, an incredible amount of independence within the border. No laws could be made for those states without their approval, no taxation. They couldn't, soldiers couldn't be drafted for wartime without the consent of the states. So in sum, the Peace of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War really does show a decline in the importance of religion as a motive for conflict. In fact, some historians say that the 30 Years' War was the quote-unquote final nail in the coffin of the Middle Ages because it recognized that nations should be sovereign over their own religious pursuits. It ended the Holy Roman Empire as an effective entity. The 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia really do indicate the rise of France as the major hegemonic state in Europe during the second half of the 17th century. It also shows the weakening of the Holy Roman Empire and the strengthening of those German states in particular, the rise of Prussia within the German states. You see changes in diplomacy. You see the recognition that diplomacy works at times and doesn't at other times. And it does affect subsequent treaties later on, such as the Treaty of Utrecht and the Treaty of Versailles even later. You see the decline of Poland as a state in Europe and the rise of Sweden. And you see the end of Spanish influence in the Netherlands or in Northern Europe. So the Peace of Westphalia is a benchmark year in European history. 1648 is a date that you should learn, and you should obviously learn the provisions of that treaty. And by viewing the PowerPoint, looking at that map, it'll help you remember